Hey guys, welcome back to another video, and for today I wanted to make a guide on the best champions you can play to learn macro. Usually when people think of aspects that lead to bettering your playstyle, two things come to mind: your macro and your mechanics, or basically how well you understand the game versus how well you can actually execute. Because Riot has been spending a lot of time trying to make champions that are really dynamic and explosive just to put on a good show for the professional scene, there's a big focus on mechanics, and most of the community believes that to climb you just need to be insanely good at finessing your opponent with champions like Yasuo, Irelia, Riven, Kai'Sa, Zed, etc. But in all reality, your mechanics only get you as far as Platinum 2 or 1, Diamond 4 at the very best. Sure, it makes for some good Reddit montage plays to get that insane 1v3 outplay, but how often does that happen from game to game? Most of the time, it's extremely rare for someone with a terrible sense of game knowledge and macro understanding to climb very far. I made a video a couple years back on game knowledge being the most important part of becoming a better player. So just to refresh, on screen I have a list of some examples of macro. This isn't exhaustive, of course. There are still hundreds if not thousands of things that pertain to game knowledge. But for this video I want to give you the best champions to play in order to practice that knowledge. These champions usually work the best because of two factors. They're pretty simple to play in terms of mechanics and generally don't require more than a few games to get an understanding of how combos and executions work. Secondly, they may or may not have one or more abilities in their kit that can drastically affect the flow of gameplay, and therefore, in the hands of an inexperienced player, it can be very useless, while in the hands of a master, it can almost single-handedly influence an entire game. Champions like these may be very easy to play since their kit is for all intents and purposes really easy to execute, but that also means because there's little room for outplay, you have to spend a lot more mental energy knowing when to use your abilities. Mechanically intensive champions require much more effort to master when it comes to combos and rotations, but in exchange, they're rewarded by being able to handle a lot more contingencies than those that are easy to play since they have things like escapes or ways to avoid enemy damage. Anyway, we're going to be going from top to bottom, so let's start off first with top lane, and I'm going to be giving that title to Shen. This is a no-brainer because Shen is basically the only champion in the game who can immediately join his allies in a fight no matter where he is on the map thanks to Stand United, at least in the top lane. That gives him the option to split push while simultaneously discouraging his opponents from engaging on a prime target because they know his ultimate is available. That much is prevailing wisdom. Anyone who's played with or against Shen knows at least that much. But I think more credit needs to be given to his basic abilities. As you know, he's one of the more threatening tanks to duel thanks to his really high % health damage, and he can do a fantastic job of shutting down a lot of cheese top laners like Kled, Akali, Lucian, Renekton, and whatnot. That being said, because he has very high energy costs and long cooldowns on most of his abilities, it requires the player to have a competent grasp on trade windows, lane management, and exploiting cooldowns. Additionally, he's one of the only champions in top lane who teaches you positional awareness thanks to his Spirit Blade mechanic, as you wanted to strike through your lane opponent to get the bonus damage. A lot of players see Shen's consistently high win rate and attribute that to him just being super broken. But most of the time, Shen actually loses lane against a lot of champions he supposedly counters, routinely having much less gold by 15 minutes, but he's not supposed to win lane. I mean, he can, never a bad thing to get an advantage top, but that's not what you're supposed to do as him. Your goal as Shen is to hold top lane well enough to prevent your enemy laner from getting fed, while exerting pressure elsewhere on the map thanks to your ult. Spirit's Refuge is also a really good ability in teamfights because if timed correctly, it can neutralize a lot of damage. But its strict timing window means you have to have a good understanding of when champions dish out a lot of damage through auto attacks. All in all, a consistently good top laner to teach both laning phase macro and mid to late game macro. An honorable mention goes to Garen, who doesn't have the same utility as Shen but instead is a very straightforward champion that forces you to know exactly when you're at your strongest and to minimize your points of vulnerability as best as you can. In other words, he places a greater emphasis on laning phase and champion knowledge since more often than not, the difference between a good and bad Garen is whether or not he knows if he can kill you or can't. Picking the best macro champion for jungle was difficult since jungle is all about macro, but if I had to choose the creme de la creme, it probably goes to Nunu. He's really easy to play. His Q does damage and heals, his W is a mini Scion ultimate that's really easy to steer, to use his E you basically just have to mash the key while running around, and his ultimate is a double press AoE nuke. Simple enough. Similar to Shen, Nunu is no slouch in the damage department as he can still do a surprising amount, especially during the early game thanks to his high base damage. And he has the tools necessary to perform well in the jungle such as high clear speed, easy objectives thanks to his Q, a metric ton of hard crowd control, and most importantly a fast tempo. The only things he somewhat struggles with are that he tends to do poorly against champions who either deal massive amounts of burst damage like Karthus, Talia, and Rek'Sai, and champions who can completely ignore him and go straight for his teammates like Vi, Evelynn, and Olaf. Aside from those, he's an amazing counter against bruisers, assassins, and other tanks for being really durable, really fat, and really annoying. The hard part is knowing when and where you need to be. Nunu may be good at shutting enemy junglers down really hard, but that's only if you know how to stop them, such as tracking their movements, counter-ganking, securing objectives, etc. Positional awareness is very key for him at all stages of the game because his attacks and movements are very telegraphed compared to the likes of Lee Sin, Kayn, and Kha'Zix who can approach in a multitude of ways. Thanks to the massive hitboxes on his abilities, he's a control tank, meaning he's really good at putting enemy champions in bad spots. Not to mention, he's got one of the best ganking abilities in the game in the form of his W, so he's good at helping you get practice in on catching overextended targets during the laning phase, and then in the mid to late game where you find that one squishy AD carry who's CSing just a little bit too far. But you have to be aware of where your own team is since he himself doesn't do the most amount of damage. Honorable mention goes to Amumu. Just a disclaimer, he's really weak right now because Riot nerfed him and his items to high heaven, but if you're watching this video in the future and Riot gave Amumu back some extra stuff, he's a great second option for sort of the same reasons as Nunu, although I would argue Nunu is just an infinitely better pick, though he does have a high ban rate so it's always good to have a secondary. Some of you might wonder why I didn't list Ivern as the best macro jungler even though that's pretty much all he is, and that's because Ivern requires you to play in such an unconventional way as a jungler that the habits you build while playing Ivern don't really transfer over to any other champion. Moving on to the mid lane, Twisted Fate hands down, and for much of the same reasons as Shen. In my opinion, TF is the most balanced mid laner in the game. Not too strong, not too weak. He has literally only two abilities, a skill shot and auto attack, that's it. Some might argue this makes him super easy and boring to play. No, you couldn't be more wrong. He's arguably one of the hardest mid laners to master because of the sheer polarity in his playstyle. Twisted Fate is very immobile and has roughly a 3 to 5 second window where there's basically nothing he can do after he uses his Q and W. Unlike Shen, TF does not have a very good matchup spread since he's not built to win lane, while also having some insanely hard lane counters like Fizz, Yasuo, and LeBlanc. To learn him, you need an immaculate sense of map awareness and positioning because one small misstep can have an assassin hack you to pieces in less than 1 second, or you get engaged on by an enemy tank with practically no way to protect yourself aside from a stun or red card. His ultimate is basically a more flexible version of Shen's, and because of it, most of the time, Twisted Fate's pressure is omnipresent at all stages of the game because he can pop up basically anywhere. If you want to learn a champion specifically for macro and map awareness, Twisted Fate is the poster child for that. He's got strong wave clear once you put a few points into his Q, his roaming potential is amazing, and he's one of the best split pushers in the game thanks to said wave clear and being a Lich Bane user, so he melts towers. If you have an exposed inhibitor or worse an exposed nexus, you have to constantly keep track of TF on the map since he can backdoor incredibly well. Overall, an extreme example of a macro focused champion, but damn if he's not the best one. Honorable mentions for mid lane go to Pantheon and Galio. They don't have the same global pressure as TF, but they make up for it by being way more self-sufficient. Pantheon is really strong 1v1, especially if he's against a squishy AD carry or mage, while Galio shares a lot of characteristics with Nunu being this bulky wall that's hard to take down and has a ton of crowd control. For bot lane, there's usually two types of AD carries, the utilities and the 1v9ers. Obviously, we're not going to be looking at the 1v9ers, we're going to be looking at the former. Utility AD carries sacrifice a bit of damage in exchange for being able to provide more than just that. Champions like Ashe, Jhin, Senna, Vars, Sivir, etc. Now, that's not to say they can't deal their fair share of damage because no, they most certainly can. But usually key abilities like their ultimates or their Ws are what you look out for more than whether or not they can chainsaw people down in a single hit. With that said, I think the best macro AD carry is Ashe. She has on-demand vision with Hawkshot, a massive long-range stun, her auto attacks slow enemies, and her W is amazing for harassing and providing cover fire. Naturally, her weakness is similar to Twisted Fate in that she's extremely vulnerable to divers and assassins, so positioning is key. Technically, positioning is important for every AD carry, you don't want to be caught vein spotting, but for Ashe it's even more so. Contrary to popular belief, she's actually really good at dealing heavy amounts of damage to certain enemy champions, namely bruisers and short-range fighters, just as long as she's not locked down by CC herself and she's keeping a decent line of scrimmage. You still need to be able to attack move as she can do an amazing job kiting, but that's sort of the bare minimum you need to be able to do as an AD carry anyway. The rest comes down to how well you can position in a team fight so as to make sure you're not being flanked on by like a Riven or Kha'Zix, and to decide whether to aim your ultimate at a diver chasing after you or at someone running away. I think most bot mains would recommend picking up Ashe, especially if you're new to ADC, since she helps you get started with what aspects of macro you need to understand before you start switching over to more mechanically intensive carries like Kai'Sa, Vayne, and Samira. Generally speaking, it's better to build your fundamentals before you build your mechanics. Honorable mention goes to Jhin, who has the same long-range pick potential but offers way more burst damage, especially against squishy champions. That and you don't need to do the attack move that much on him. The only downside is that he's not as safe as Ashe to play and requires you to be good at landing skill shots. Then again, there aren't many other options for learning macro as an AD carry. Support. This is another tough one because supports essentially carry double the macro to make up for most ADC mains running around like headless chickens. But in all seriousness, I would pick Zilean. If you watched my Why No One Plays Zilean, it goes more in depth on why I believe Zilean is an amazing support to learn macro. He's all about control and target management, landing time bombs on areas to zone targets, deciding whether or not to use time warp to speed up or slow down targets, not to mention who to speed up or slow down, and of course his ultimate can turn the tide of an entire fight around if used on the right person at the right time. He functions very much like a chess player, requiring you to take your time when playing him to establish control around the map and force a bad move out of the opposing team. He can do a lot of damage, especially if going full AP, but it's not your main priority. Since you lack any heals, shields, or on-demand hard crowd control, you have to pay close attention to where everyone is on the map, especially so you know who to speed up, who to slow down, who to press your ultimate on, things like that, and again, you have to be careful about your mistakes because you can't just heal it right back up. To be good at Zilean, you need a very strong presence of mind to stay calm in hectic situations to know what to do in a fight. While other supports usually have one job, whether it's to shield or buff their allies or lock down key enemies, knowing which one to do is exceptionally tougher on Zilean, but in cases it could be more rewarding in the long run if you turn it into muscle memory. Especially because most of the things you learn as Zilean can directly be applied to other enchanter supports like Nami and Bard, as well as tank supports like Thresh and Brawl. I don't really have much of an honorable mention since every support in their own way can do a good job teaching you macro, but out of all of them I'd wager Zilean is just slightly better when it comes to strictly learning the game sense. So that wraps it up for my list: Shen, Nunu, Twisted Fate, Ashe, and Zilean. If you think any other champions are better for understanding macro, let me know about them in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your opinions. If you'd like to support my channel, best way you can do so is like, comment, share, subscribe. Join me in my Discord server, follow me on my socials, and consider donating to my Patreon page if you feel like it. All links are down below. Lastly, check out my other videos if you haven't watched them yet. But that's gonna be it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon for the next video. Take care.